microphone. So, good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's, because I'm in China, TMS seminar, and to introduce our speaker, Dr. Evelyn Kustatscher from the Tyrolean State Museums and the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Evelyn is an internationally recognized expert on late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic plant communities, and not only, especially those from the Southern Alps in northern Italy. Her work combines plant microfossils, palynology, and paleoecology to reconstruct how terrestrial ecosystem responded to environmental change during critical intervals of Earth history. In addition to these scientific contributions, she also serves on the editorial boards of several major journals in our field, as Acta Paleobotanica, Taxon, Paleodiversity and Paleoenvironments, GeoBios, the Review of Paleobotany and Palynology, and so on. This evening, she will present her talk with the title The Evolution of the Kungurian and Cisuralian flora in the paleotropics, with a focus on the southern Alps of northern Italy. Her work offers important new insights into early Permian vegetation and the dynamics of paleotropical ecosystem. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Evelyn. Thank you, Evelyn, to accept our invitation.
Thanks a lot, Amalia. I hope it doesn't disturb too much the background noise, but apparently they are working near my office at the moment, so there is some background noise perhaps going through. Thanks really a lot for the invitation. It's for me a great pleasure to speak about one of the projects that I'm at the moment leading, especially on the early Permian floras in the Southern Alps. And let's see if I can move the screen. So just a moment. I have to figure out how to move the screen, sorry.
I click over if you have the screens over the presentation.
Yeah, just doesn't move. It was moving before, but doesn't move now. So just give me a moment. Just to try to just represent. Oh, goodness, that's what not should happen. Sorry.
It's okay.
Oh, goodness, that's always happening when you don't need it, isn't it?
It was working fine, yeah.
Just get again. So happily enough, it was working before, so it should be working again now. So yeah, now it goes. Okay, so sorry and thanks for your patience. Now, as I said, as Amalia said, actually, I'm mostly working in northern Italy, in the Southern Alps. So what you see here on the left-hand side is the picture of Italy with the province or actually the region of South Tyrol and Trentino. And on the right-hand side, you see in the brown all the outcrops of what we call the supervolcano of Bolzano, or what often is also called the Artesian volcanic district. So which is an area which during the early Permian was very active from a volcanic point of view, but happily enough, it was not only active from a volcanic point of view, but it has also some very long stages in between where we have a quiet area from the volcanic side, but a lot of sediments that has been deposited there. Just in order to understand what I'm talking about when you're speaking about a supervolcano, we have about 12 million years of time this volcanic activity was going on. And during these 12 million years of time, we had exactly two big super eruptions. One which caused the so-called caldera of Gargazzone, which was about 277 million years ago, with a production of about 3,000 kilometers square of volcanic rocks. And the other one is what we call the small one, which is no small in any comparison in any case, is the one from the caldera of Aura, which has been erupting in 274 million years ago, and which produced about 1,500 kilometers square of material. Just in order to understand how much that is, if we compare it to other super eruptions that we know, such, for example, as Wawa Springs of Toba, you can see that one of the two, the Gargazzone one, is even bigger than Toba in the sense of production of material. And if we would consider Yellowstone as a total, it would be, of course, much, much more bigger. But if you just think of some of its eruptions, or taking the single eruption independently, then most of them are around 1 kilometer square. So it's actually an enormous amount of material that has been produced. And that has, of course, big influences on the landscape as well. So if you just take the geological map of the areas of the central area that you can see here, you see the borders of the small caldera just north to Bolzano. You see a lot of different colors. That means that there are a lot of different eruptions that have been taking place. So it's not just these two super volcanoes, a super eruption that have been taking place, but there have been several different formations, both of volcanic and sedimentary rocks that we can distinguish. And that's the good thing, because we have these intercalations between volcanic rocks on one side and sedimentary rocks on the other side. And this big system with the two calderas that has been formed created somehow a graben structure, or not really a graben structure, but something like a depression that has given, of course, the possibility for a lot of sediment to form, which is the one I'm most interested in, because in these sediments, we can find a lot of different fossils. It's not the only volcanic epicenter that has been taking place in the Southern Alps. So if you see the blue line, which is actually the line of the Southern Alps that limits the Southern Alps from the Central Alps, you see to the right the Artesian Volcanic District, but you see that there are a lot of other smaller basins in there as well. Not all of them have sedimentary rocks. Some of them are only volcanic rocks in there, but still we can compare our volcanic district to them. And so extending even more our information, both geographically and stratigraphically, as you can see later. So here you have the three main basins that we can see that have both volcanic and sedimentary rocks intercalated with each other. You know the aerobic basin. You will know probably from the names also the Collio Basin. So here we distinguish between the eastern and the western part. And then we have the Artesian Volcanic District, which seems pretty simple from the outside, but actually if you go into detail, you see that the eastern and the northwestern part and the northern part are a little bit different between each other. And you see each time in this, let's call it brownish color, that is always the sedimentary rocks, and the reddish orange colors are always the volcanic rocks. So you see that actually the volcanic district, Artesian Volcanic District, is one where we have a lot of sedimentary rocks in between the volcanic rocks for actually a long time. So what we think it's about 12 million of years, but at the moment we are redating some of the formations because we have quite some big error bars sometimes. So the Artesian Volcanic District actually is pretty famous already since the beginning of the 19th century, even if in the last years we have been increasing the amount of fossils that have been found in that area substantially. So what we can find is more or less nicely preserved pollen. You will see some of them later on as well, of course. We have a lot of plant fossils. We have platypod footprints. We have even these famous Tridentinosaurus, which we lately, unfortunately, showed that some of the black patina that is on the top of the rock is actually not original tissue at all, even if we were hoping for it. And we have bioturbations in it. On top of them, we have concostricans and so on. And what we can do, of course, with that, due to the fact that we have these intercalated rocks, sedimentary rocks and volcanic rocks, we can try to put them on top of each other, create a stratigraphic succession, make environmental reconstruction. That's what we have been doing the last years, and what we are at the moment trying to do again is doing some more precise datings, because most of the dates that we are currently using are from 2012. Morelli et al. Did an enormous amount of work during that days to understand the age of these volcanic successions, but today, of course, we have much more precise possibilities. So we are using the information from Morelli et al., sampling some of the stratigraphic successions, both from a palynological and paleobotanical point of view, but also from a geochronological point of view, and reworking on the time frame to be even more precise in the future, hopefully, to understand how and where which plants have been appearing and distributed. So if you start from the bottom, so if you start from the oldest sediments, I just wanted to bring two of the main time slices we are studying at the moment in order not to overburden you with a lot of data. So one of the successions that is pretty famous nowadays is the succession of Sinich. By the way, you will always hear me using two names because the area is bilingual, so we are using German and Italian as official names, which means that all of the topomastic and also stratigraphic names have a double system, which is a little bit confusing from the outside. I realize it, but of course there are, let's say, political motivation to do so. So if you look at Sinico, which is close to if you have ever been to the Southern Alps, so it's north of Bolzano. And it's actually one of the first succession of sedimentary rocks that we can find within actually a volcanic formation. So it's in an intercalation inside a volcanic rock sequence, meaning that there is some stasis of a volcanic activity which is just going on later on as well, but just for a few hundreds of thousands of years probably, there were a little bit of a stasis where the volcano did not erupt. And what can we see there? Well, the locality is pretty nice. What you have here is a drone picture, and you see the levels from above, and you see all these different levels that you can distinguish perhaps. And if we put over that one a drawing done by Steffen Trümper, where you can see in different type of colors, yellowish, the more marley-sand levels, and this pinkish salmon colors, the sandstone levels, that you can see there is a lot of sedimentary beds that are covering each other. And on the top of them, so up to where the erosion has been hitting until now, you can see all these numbers, and each of those numbers means that we have a fossil piece of plant. Actually, it means that we have a fossil piece of stem in there, which is still standing upright. And in some of those cases, yes, you can see with the black lines, there are even roots still attached to it. So it looks like this if you go into the field. So there we have in the center here, may point it out to you here in the center. This is the stem, which was staying upright before. Now it's just empty because it has been taken out by erosion. And then you see horizontally, the roots which are going off. And Steffen did an amazing drawing of one of our main stems, and where you can see it's a flat rooted plant, which has the stem in the middle, and then it has actually the roots going out pretty flat, which are bifurcating several atoms. So what we have is a good idea about, so if you look again of our horizons, we have a good idea about the position of those various plants that have been living sort of with each other, because you see that they are actually almost all of them are on the same bedding place. So what we're seeing is actually a fossil forest. So if you take out a few of those specimens as the stem, you can see that the stem seems even more having still some cortex, even if the cortex is not preserved, but from the outside structure, you have still the surface of the cortex that you can see. And not the stems themselves, which are too thick, apparently to have been permanentized quite slowly, but some small pieces of wood that has been deposited in the sandstone have a beautifully preserved cells. So what you can see here are very small pieces of wood. You see here this 1 centimeter scale in each of the drawings, and you see amazingly preserved plant material actually, but only the small material is actually that good preserved. And what you also can see here on the right-hand side is that you also have groups of spores. So in this permineralized levels of sandstone, we have both pieces of wood that are preserved and also spores that are preserved quite nicely in a three-dimensional way. So what is the reconstruction and the conclusion taken by Steffen? So what we can see here is this this sandstone level where you have these plants growing in an alluvial setting. So towards south, we have an alluvial system going on in this almost deltaic area between the alluvial fan and the lake. We have a forest that is settling, and due to volcanic activity, what's happening is that we have sort of a landslide in a very simplistic way, which is covering our wood, is destroying the wood actually, and is preserving part of the stems in situ in an upright position, not very high, just a few decimeters high up, unfortunately, but it's there. And it's preserved for us today to understand. And what also happens is that later on, so what we can see here is actually, why do we know that there's probably there's an eruption that has been going on? We have the sedimentary structure that show this microtectonic structure typical of earthquakes, and we have on the surface of those levels, we have pumice lapilli, which is also indicative of a volcanic activity going on. Not a very active one, not in the sense of a lava stream, but some smaller eruption has been taking place. And then all the area has been covered by a lake. And you see this very fine-grained sediments up here, which is called in Unit 4. And in these levels, actually, we find beautifully preserved, even if small plant fragments. So here you have the centimeter scale. You see that the fragments are very small, but you see that what we have is sometimes even three-dimensionally and charcoalified remains of plants. So you have ovaliferous organs here of Baltaspermelis, plants of a seed fern. You have some pieces of cordite leaves. You have some fragments of stems of some sphenophytes. And in this case, what you have is an axis, and I may perhaps point it out to you if you're not so familiar with the groups of Sphenopsis. Here you have the axis, and those are the three-dimensionally preserved casts. Unfortunately, this cast is not three-dimensionally preserved in the sense of permineralization, remains of Sphenopteris, which means a seed fern. So if you look further, you see the same thing with the conifers. Sometimes we have them just normally carbonified, but sometimes we have also here, we have this three-dimensionally preserved, so we can take a cast of this, of our shields and actually have a three-dimensional form out of it. And also on the right-hand side, you see a cone. So we have quite some fragments, even if small, of plants that are nicely preserved that can be described. So what we also did try to do is, of course, with all the fine-grained sediment, to sample for polynomorphs, because we wanted to understand better the composition of the flora. Unfortunately, the lower part did yield a lot of organic material, but no sporomorphs. Only the upper part of the early section, where the entire area has been covered by the lake, actually sporomorphs are preserved and permit us to understand which plants have been laying there, which are actually the levels where we find also the small fragments of plants. On the other side, both in the macromaterial, as you have seen, but also in the polynomorphs, we have a lot of charcoalified material that is preserved. So there has been something going on, probably something like a wildfire or whatever, that created charcoalified remains that later has been preserved. Here you see some of from the paper of Valle d'Alst, the preservation of the taxonomy of the spores and pollen that has been preserved. And what you can probably easily detect is the fact that you have, of course, a lot of early Permian, typically early Permian remains, but then also some material sticks out, like, for example, Nuscosporides or so on, which you would not expect to see actually in the early Permian normally, because at least when I've been growing up, I've been always taught that Nuscosporides is actually a typical late Permian element, which we actually have been described being also from the late Permian Blätterbach section in the Dolomites. And actually it has been described originally from there. So actually there's a lot of materials going on that is normally not presumed to be there, and which was quite intriguing us. So we have been going on working on it. So just as for understanding, in the beginning, we have the smaller volcanoes going on with these intercalations of sedimentation. At some point, 277 million years ago, we have this big caldera eruption. This big caldera eruption, here we have a small film that we did for an exhibition. So you see first this local, smaller, let's call them smaller volcanoes that erupt, which is Monteluco, which is on the top left side, which is the one from the Sinigo area, which erupted and created the preservation of the plants there. And then we have actually a caldera. And the caldera is the fact that you have first all the surface that is going up and then breaking down once eruption is taking place. And this is quite good for us because you have this area which is in the end sort of a elliptic area where you have a caldera. And the caldera means that on one side you produce a lot of volcanic material, Here you see that half of the mountains between the two white lines is actually produced by this one single volcanic eruption. So it's between 800 and 1,000 meters thickness of volcanic rock produced by one eruption. What would also happen is, due to the fact that you have a caldera, you have then a depressed area. And this is very helpful, of course, for us, because in the depressed area, you will find a possibility to get additional lakes, additional fluvial systems that can create and permit life to rebuild again. So what we can see is on top of this eruption, a lot of lakes, sediments coming in. So this here is the succession of Cristiano, you see the river, which has been cutting through our beautifully marly sediments in here. And another section is Trejovo that you can study. Here you have some plant fossils because they're more nicely preserved in Trejovo. What we have are horsetails. Again, we have seed ferns. We have even ginkgo leaves in here. And again, we have these Phenopteris leaves that we have already been discussing before. We have Lodevia, which is about this mammalian seed fern, just to give you an idea. And then we have Hermitia, which is a typical Voltzialian conifer, but also Collia and especially Dolomitia. And now Dolomitia again is who knows the paleo-botanical collections of the Southern Alps know that Dolomitia is a typical plant fossil that has been found in the Lopingian, also in the late Permian of the Southern Alps. But we find it again also in the early Permian. So there's something going on evidently in the early Permian that is not so been clearly described before. And then we describe some very strange structure, like this bifurcated structure that you can see here, which we originally thought it would be something like a ginkgo leaf, but then we realized that it has some very strong mid-venation structure. On the other side, it seems pretty fragile, like the texture. So we have still no idea about where it belongs to. At the moment, we just described it as a new species. And but there are some structures that are bifurcating in the early Permian as well throughout the world, sometimes more regularly than not otherwise. What you can also sometimes have, and this happens in the case of Gaul, of the Gaul locality, is that we have not beautifully well-preserved plant fossils after you have seen them from the Trejovo area, but rather that we have really small fragments of plants that most people would probably, well, not even collect because they would be too ugly. And at the first idea of when you look at them, this seems almost not preserved enough to give any information. But it was wonderful that nonetheless we had a big outing and with a lot of students. So we brought home everything and just wanted to check whether we could see under the microscope something, because we realized from the beginning that there were some venation pattern going on. There were some structures that we could see. And so we said, well, let's just bring everything back to the museum. As I said, that's something that you would not do if you are very far away from your home, because you would need to bring them home on your backpack, and you would decide quite strongly which one to take. In this case, it's quite easily to reach, so we decided to bring everything home. And it was very good that we did that one, because we figured out at some point that these plant fossils actually had cuticles preserved. So that's actually one thing that you would normally expect to have in a lot of time periods, especially from the Triassic onwards. But actually, even if the late Permian in the Southern Alps gives very good plant material with nicely preserved cuticles, we have never had any plant fossil with cuticles preserved described so far from the Southern Alps. So actually from most parts of Europe, for the early Permian, because normally the preservation is not good enough. So you have impressions of them. Sometimes when you have compressions, they are too carbonized to be actually giving cuticles. But to our surprise, this very ugly material, and as I said, most people would never take it home at all, gave origin to extremely nicely preserved cuticles. So you can very nicely see all the stomatiditas, the subsidiary cells, the epidermal cells, how they are organized. Some of them have even some hair still attached to the outer side of the cuticles. So we were quite happy, but somehow to our surprise, but perhaps not too much of a surprise, on the other side, we couldn't completely fit up the cuticle pattern with the macrofossil pattern. So we still have some macrofossils that don't have any cuticles, but we have much more cuticles by now. Also, thanks to a master thesis carried out by Matthias Delfossen that shows that there is quite a hidden biodiversity among the plants from the early Permian, at least from the Southern Alps, but probably also from other areas than what we believed before, just based on macromaterial. What we also find by looking on some of those dispersed cuticles, or some of them in situ and some of them dispersed cuticles, is sometimes these holes. And these holes are not something like broken off fragments due to the needle treatment or whatever it is, but you can see that there is some thickening in the margins on the sides, showing us that this is actually holes that has been created pre-plant dying. So the plants reacted trying to close the tissue during its life, so the hole has been produced during the life of the plant. And actually, these are typical examples of plant-animal interactions. And so we can have a try to see them, and even if we cannot sort of identify the species that created them, we can at least identify the groups, like we do today when we are going out in the garden and we have some insects that are eating the leaves of our plants, like in this case, the tomatoes. We know which type of which groups of insects do those things, or which larvae do those things. So we can sort of get back to groups of insects that have been creating those plant-animal interactions, and getting some information on insects, even if we have so far not found any insect wings or whatever in our localities. What else is due to the fact that we have different positions. Well, you have to imagine that we have these rivers that are eroding our Southern Alps, so opening the sections on various places, so that what we can see is same lake sediment in different positions. So what we have here in this case is we have Cristiano, and Gaul on the other side. And Gaul has been collected from what we established both on the palinophages and sedimentology on a lake margin, whereas Christian has been deposited inside the lake. And what we can see is the same type of climate, the same moment of time in different positions in the lake, and compare how the different information on which plants have been available at that time are influencing our understanding in our reconstruction. So for example, Gaul, of course, which is almost completely to the margin. We have even some footprints, meaning that the margin, so the level of this lake has been dropping and going up and down sometimes. So we have a lot of, even there, we have some spores and so on, which are almost completely missing in the Kungurian section. The typical effect that we know all, that the farther away we are from the border of a lake or a sea, the less we get the information in from the water transported elements. But it's quite nice to see that one. And so this is the reconstruction and what has been drawn by Francesca Vallée to try to reconstruct these different positions of Kungurian and Gaal. And due to the fact that we made an exhibition for the museum on the supervolcano of Bolzano some years ago, we were able to order also some drawings by Davide Bonadonna. And what you can see here is actually Trejovo reconstructed, where you can see the lake towards the north in the drawing, and all the eruptors moving around along the lake margin, and the different plants. So here you have foresters and conifers growing around the lakes and close to the margin of the lakes itself, leaving their fossils down inside the lake sediments. So we can take, so I showed you 2 moments of time, but we have several of those. And I can take, of course, now each of the information that we get out from the various intercalations when the intercalations are fossiliferous. Of course, not all of the intercalations give plant fossils. So we have some intercalations that we only can find bioturbations and other material, and we don't have any plant fossils. So these are divided here. But what you can see is that we can go through the entire Kungurian and look here based on the plant fossils alone, and what kind of plant fossils that are there, from the lycophytes down to the conifer, and also some groups that we don't know where they belong to. And what you see is actually that we have all major plant groups there. We have, of course, like it's often, a lot of uncertainty about some of the plant fossils that we are here. There's especially with the fronds that can also sometimes be seed ferns have there, but all the groups that you would expect, they are actually there. And apparently from the plant fossils that you have, that you can see there, most of them seem to be present already in the early Kungurian, with some exception like Dolomitia, which is this Volzialian, modern Volzianian type of conifer, which is coming out only with the late Kungurian, for example, and so on. So this means that we have actually the entire Kungurian, through the entire Kungurian, that we can look into and see if anything happens there. And apparently at local scale, as you can see, there is something that happens. We have an increase in diversity towards the late Kungurian, so there's a less diversity in the early Kungurian than towards the late Kungurian, that especially it's moving towards more dry groups. So you see an increase in conifers, you see an increase in what I think nowadays are seed ferns, and of course all the other gymnosperms, which are sometimes not even present in the early Permian, or they are present but more rare. And actually this turnaround that I showed you already before with the conifers is now becoming quite interesting, because apparently what we have is the moment of where we have both the primitive and the modern Volziales together. This is actually going on in the Kungurian. So in the Kungurian, this is a moment where we have modern Volzialian conifers and let's call them more primitive, so more Paleozoic Valdialian conifers put together in there. So meaning that could be actually an origination point for the more modern conifer groups that we are normally used to see in the late Permian. So if you look at the spore moths, we have much more sections than with the plant fossils before. As I said already before, it's really astonishing how completely different preservation can be in the various successions we are studying. Some of them are really amazingly and beautifully preserved, and some of them are really, let's call them, almost a disparate version of, you only can identify them if you have an extreme experience there. And happily enough, Amalia is part of the working group, and with her extreme experience on identifying also badly preserved spores and pollen of the Permian, we can get quite out, even if in those localities where the material is not so nicely preserved. So, but of course, what happens is as soon as you put inside the palynological record, you find much more elements. So first of all, we have more successions that we can study here. We have only Artesian volcanic district, so no Collier district and Arabic Alps considered at all. But you see that we have much more levels where we can find some spores and pollen. And here you see that the pollen are generally dominating in diversity for the spores that are much more rare. But you see also that the spores are present in the lower part as well as in the upper part. And there's an increasing diversity from the lower part again versus the upper part, with especially also a lot of conifers and in this case also several spores coming in. As I said, I mentioned already before, we had some taxa that I was always used that they are typically late Permian ones, like here Nuscosporidis, that I have been studying from the late Permian of the Blätterbach before, but then we found it again also present in the Kungurian, so we were reworking or retaking, actually Ivan Barriero took all the literature out that has been around in the on Nuscosporidis, evaluating it, and actually what he figured out in the end was the fact that there are probably two morphotypes. Let's call them one a more primitive morphotype, which is already appearing in the Gondwana at the end of the Carboniferous and moving into the early Permian. And then in the Kungurian, we have the typical Nuscosporidis type of elements that we are known, but they are absolutely identical with the ones that we are knowing from the late Permian, actually from Europe or America, and we can move them on into the Lapinja. So unfortunately for me, which I love Artesia very much, Nuscosporidis has been not only produced by Artesia, there has to be some other ancestors of Voltzielen conifers that have been present already in the early Permian that created the same type of pre-pollen, which is quite nice and information. Now, Amalia, of course, was also working on that for a long time. She had old sample, even older samples than what we have been studying. And she already at some time ago observed that there was some material that was more typical, let's call it from later sediments, from the Guadalupe or Further Pingeon, that she also found in the Gunchina Formation. And so we compared the data we had from the Gaul locality and she had from the Gaul locality and came up with quite a number, as you can see here, at least 6 species that are actually moving down their first occurrences into the Kungurian, which, as you can imagine, makes some differences for us for the future, because some of them are typically elements that we would normally presume to find in mostly in the Lopinjan, or what in case we would find them in earlier sediments mixed together with what we could consider early Permian elements, and we would normally call it a Thuringian flora, which would meaning that we would typically consider it middle Permian flora. But actually, because normally that was the idea, so we have the early Permian, then we have the late Permian, and then in the middle Permian we have something like a mixture of the two. But apparently this, from a palynological perspective, this mixture is probably already starting, at least with the late Kungurian, in some cases, perhaps even with the middle Kungurian. So they are actually, we have to be a little bit more careful, perhaps at least in the Southern Alps in the future, that sometimes when we find those taxa, we cannot use them as absolute dating elements or as absolute markers for the Thuringian anymore. So we have to extend it a little bit. But I think that's quite interesting because, of course, by combining this radiometric datings together with our fossil record has been sampled in a very high resolution, considering that we are in the Permian, of course, that we can give some quite good information about the biostratigraphy and first occurrences now of these elements, at least in the Southern Alps, perhaps in Europe. and even is currently working on a new biostratigraphic scheme for that one. So if we use the same graph that we have been using before for the plants, also for the polynomorph, of course, what always happens is that we have a higher biodiversity coming out if we look at the spores and pollen. What you can see, especially that we had much more gymnosperms even than what we have been presuming already before. So we have a lot of different groups of gymnosperms and conifers that are coming in. So I think that there's really an important element of seed ferns and conifers that is coming in the early Permian already. Much more than what we are normally used to think about when we think about other areas in Europe, because most of them come from the Athinskian or from the Sakmarian, which are much wider elements. So even again here, it's not just with the late Permian that we're coming in with this absolutely gymnosperm dominated floras, but we have them actually already at the end of the early Permian, which makes quite takes quite a logical if we consider the fact that, of course, we have what has been described by Marchetti et al. By 2022, a Athinskian warmer element. So if we do it in the Athinskian, we have a shift towards more warmer climate in comparison to what has been going on in the Sakmarian and the Athinskian. Actually, it makes a lot of sense that during the Kungurian, we have much more dry elements and much more gymnosperms than what we would have considered before. Even if the diversity is still very high, and that's because we have all these small level lakes that have been deposited in these areas where you have the caldera, and so you have these quite wetter spots in the caldera. So it's not dry, that dry. So you have a lot of mixed elements in there as well, but you see already this evolution towards the more xerophytic floras, and probably a little bit earlier than what we would normally consider it before. So this, as I said, is nothing that is finished at all. This is what is at the moment going on. We just started actually at the end of 2024, but to be honest, really, we started in 2025, a new project which is called Calibrating a Deglaciation Area, Caldera, and which is actually comparing now the Artesian volcanic district, when you see it on the right high up, with the aerobic basin and the Callio basin, not only from a perspective of the macrofossils, which have been done a little bit before already. So we are studying now more in detail these areas in order to compare it with the Artesian volcanic district, with the Artesian volcanic district. And we are creating so extension, because you see that here we have some sediments that are present also when we have volcanic activity going on. So we could extend a little bit towards the Athinskian, our sediments, hopefully, and having even a higher resolution within the Kungurian with that one. And especially what we are trying to do with the group of the ATH in Zurich. And here you see some of the elements, apart from even on the left-hand side, but you see all the colleagues also from the Zurich group that we're trying to date in a much higher resolution our volcanic sediments, because this will give us the possibility perhaps to distinguish if within the Kungurians there could be some stepwise step-like comparison, and which of course would be extremely helpful for the future for biostratigraphy if we could divide the Kunguria into different biozonations from a palynological point of view, due to the fact that we have such a high resolution that we can gain by studying by dating the volcanic rocks. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer all your questions if you have.
Thank you, Evelyn. Very interesting and nice talk. Questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Sure.
Two questions, really. First of all, in your lacustrine units, do you find any evidence of algae or phytoplankton of any kind? And the second question is, in a volcanic area such as this, you might expect to find some influence of volcanic gases on the development of the spores and pollen, deformed sacci and that kind of thing. Have you seen any of that?
So regarding algae, for example, this bifurcating structure that I described, I said that I have no clue what it belongs to. At some point, we were thinking that it could be actually an algae, because if we look at the isotopic signature, it does not really stay with the others. So we have tried to do taxonomically, so taxonomic focused isotopic analysis on single elements, and they're staying a little bit outside. So we are not completely sure whether that is a terrestrial plant. Otherwise, we don't have that much of algal cysts and so on. The general idea was that perhaps the water itself would not be so healthy, because when we look at the metal enrichment of the sediments, which we did not yet publish, then we see an increase in elements that would not make a life in water so funny. And we have some ideas that there must be some hydrothermal activity going on as well. What we have found is some stromatolitic or microbialitic structures. So we don't have real algae in the sense of algae, but we have, apart from the Tragovia perhaps, but what we have is some microbialites in certain areas. And actually that's something that has been described as sometimes carbonatic and sometimes cherty layers have been described full of plant, well, let's say organic remains, but not really definable. But remains have been already described by Christoph Spöttl in 1998 in an abstract of the Petrol Association once. So yes, there is for sure some volcanic activity going on. We did not yet identify teratologies, because that was so far, we were only trying to get an idea about the spores and pollen that are inside there, because we were a little bit, well, let's say intrigued by the fact that we did not always find exactly what we were expecting to. And in some cases, we were finding more than we were expecting, like the groups that we would normally not identify in the early Permian. And we had to recheck again by sampling again whether we were sure that we were absolutely in the early Permian. So we did not yet completely look at that. Ivan is currently look at all the slides that we have in the museum, and I know that he has also an open eye for that one, but we have not yet data on that one.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. Thank you. There is a question of Eugenie.
Sorry.
Which taxonomic group? Eugenie, please.
My question is about
Okay.
which taxonomy of tree stumps would you show start?
Yeah, some of them seems conifers, not all of them. The problem is that the preservation of the stems, they probably decay too quickly to be really big chunks of material preserved. So the best preservation we actually have in the material that has been found to fall into the grounds. And actually, one of the things that is very strange there, but we have not yet completely published it either, is that we have something that seems like Liginopteroideales, which actually should not be there because they're sort of dying out at the end of the Carboniferous. But something like structure that looked towards that one, and then we have a lot of coniferous fragments in there as well.
Maybe also chordates? No, not
so far
chordates.
not. So far not. But the thing is that they are very small, and we need to do now a lot. And we just found a few of them by chance by looking at thin sections of the rocks. So what we need now to do is entire series of those blocks to see what else is going around.
Indeed. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugenie. There is a question of Liam.
We are absolutely correct. We are looking at the microbiologic structures at the moment. And we are trying to identify, because we were intrigued by the fact that we were finding them in this lake sediments, and we wanted to understand whether or not they could be hydrothermally linked, or why they were just present in some moments of our stratigraphic succession. But that's also something that is at the moment ongoing. I hope that in the future I can give you a lot of more details about that one.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Observation? Curiosity?
I've got a question, if that's all right.
Sure.
It was a great talk, really interesting. I'm wondering whether finding all those sporomorph taxa a lot earlier than sort of in the Lipingian, if clearly there may be more the more you look, they're being brought further down. So I wonder if that's actually going to potentially alter understanding of turnover in the late Permian. And obviously there's been lots of studies of turnover of the flora, and actually it will alter all that. So I wonder if you've got an idea of how that might affect people's understanding of the lead up to the end Permian extinction.
Absolutely. I think at the moment we have really little ideas about what is really going on from the end of the swampy areas in the late Carboniferous towards the end of the Permian. I think that we always saw that a lot of the things were just going through, disappearing at the Guadalupian, sort of all the wet things are away from the Guadalupian. We have only the dry elements left in the late Permian, and the dry elements are drying out at the end of the late Permian. That's so the simple idea I have always been teaching, and I have been taught when I was a student. And the more I'm studying in this area, I get more getting confused myself, because I realize that the pictures, as most cases, it's much more complex. And I think that there is, if you remember the curves, the isotope curves, which has always been drawn by Montañez and so on, it was also always something like a line that is going forth and back, showing that there is a lot of oscillations going on. And we sort of always ignored that one, and they always thought it was a very simple picture in the paleo-botanical community. But I think that Montañez is much more right than we were believing before, and that everything is more transitionally moving in forth and back. And this forth and back, depending on where you are, paleotropics versus high latitudes. So you have earlier originations, perhaps, or longer standovers on one side, and then sometimes these local elements, like having a caldera, which gives you a wet spot inside the tropics, even if it's outside, it seems a little bit more drier. That this thing can increase our understanding of this transition from the Carboniferous towards the end of the Permian tremendously.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. There are other questions? Okay. Evelyn, thank you for this nice talk, and I'm happy of this great participation. I remember that the next talk will be on January 16. You will receive the invite, and will be presented by Dr. Carina Horno. So thank you so much for this participation, and see you soon. Bye. Thank you. Ciao.
Thanks for the invitation.